Picture this. You're arguing with someone over $5. Maybe it's a friend who owes you money. Maybe it's a stranger who's trying to shortchange you. How far would you go to get that $5 back? Would you kill for it? Today, we're looking at cases where individuals found themselves facing the ultimate penalty, not for what they did, but for what they didn't do, or for crimes so minor that death seemed impossible until it wasn't. This is Willie Francis, and his story is one of the most haunting cases in American legal history. At just 16 years old, Francis was sentenced to death for a murder he may not have committed. But what makes his case truly unprecedented is that he survived his own execution, only to be sent back to the electric chair a year later. "I'm not ready to die," Francis wrote in a letter to his lawyer. "I'm too young to die." The story begins in 1944 in St. Martinville, Louisiana, when pharmacist Andrew Thomas was found shot dead in his store. The investigation was sloppy by today's standards. No fingerprints, no physical evidence, and no witnesses to the actual shooting. But police needed a suspect, and 15-year-old Willie Francis fit the bill. He was a young black man in the Jim Crow South, and when he was found with a wallet that allegedly belonged to the victim, that was enough for authorities. "I found it on the ground," Francis insisted. "I didn't kill nobody." The trial was a mockery of justice. Francis had no real legal representation. His court-appointed attorney spent less than an hour preparing his defense. The all-white jury deliberated for just minutes before finding him guilty of first-degree murder. "Guilty as charged," the foreman announced, sealing the fate of a teenager who may have done nothing more than pick up a wallet. But the real horror was yet to come. On May 3rd, 1946, 17-year-old Willie Francis was strapped into Louisiana's electric chair. The switch was pulled, electricity coursed through his body, but something went wrong. The chair malfunctioned. Francis twisted in pain, but didn't die. "I felt a burning in my head and my left leg," Francis later described. "I jumped against the straps. I smelled smoke. Then everything went black, but I woke up." Guards had to unstrap the still conscious Francis from the chair. He had survived his own execution, something that had never happened before in American history. Francis's lawyers immediately filed appeals, arguing that subjecting him to a second execution attempt would constitute cruel and unusual punishment. Surely, they argued, surviving one execution was enough. But the Louisiana Supreme Court disagreed. The case went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, where Francis's fate hung in the balance. In a narrow 5-4 decision, the court ruled that Louisiana could indeed execute Francis a second time. Meanwhile, Francis waited on death row, knowing that the state was determined to finish what it had started. He wrote letters to anyone who would listen, maintaining his innocence and pleading for mercy. "They want to kill me for something I didn't do," he wrote to a civil rights organization. "If I'd done it, I would say so, but I didn't." On May 9th, 1947, exactly 1 year and 6 days after his first execution, Willie Francis was strapped into the electric chair again. This time, the machine worked perfectly. He was pronounced dead at 12:15 p.m. His last words were, "I'm innocent. I'm going to meet my God." Years later, new evidence emerged suggesting that Francis may indeed have been innocent. A confession from another man, found decades after the execution, indicated that someone else had killed Andrew Thomas. This is Ryan Hall, and his journey to death row began not with pulling a trigger or planning a murder, but with lending his car to friends who said they needed to collect a debt. Holly never left his house that night, never touched a weapon, and never imagined that his act of friendship would land him on death row. "I just let them borrow my car," Holly would later testify. "I had no idea anyone was going to die." The story begins in Pensacola, Florida, in 2003. Holly was 20 years old, working at a restaurant and living what he thought was a normal life. On the night of March 10th, he was at home drinking with friends when several of them mentioned they needed to go collect money that someone owed them. "Can we borrow your car?" they asked Holly. "We'll bring it right back," It seemed like a simple request. Friends borrow cars all the time. Holly tossed them his keys and thought nothing more of it. He stayed home, continued drinking, and went to bed. But his friends weren't going to collect a debt. They were planning a home invasion robbery, and Holly's car was about to become the getaway vehicle in a crime that would leave an 18-year-old girl dead. The group drove to the home of Christine Snyder, who they believed kept large amounts of cash in her house. When they broke in, they found Christine, her daughter Jessica, and Jessica's infant daughter. What was supposed to be a quick robbery turned into a nightmare. During the invasion, one of Holly's friends, Charles Miller, beat Jessica Snyder to death with a shotgun. The young mother died in front of her own baby, killed by people using Ryan Hall's car. When police arrested the perpetrators, they also came for Holly. Even though he had never left his house that night, Florida's felony murder law meant that anyone who participated in a felony that resulted in death could be charged with first-degree murder. "I didn't know they were going to hurt anyone," Holly protested during interrogation. But prosecutors saw it differently. They argued that by lending his car, Holly had made himself an accomplice to the entire crime. Under Florida law, it didn't matter that he wasn't physically present. He had provided the means for the crime to occur. "I probably should have said no," Holly admitted on the witness stand, "but I never thought anyone would die." The jury found Holly guilty of first-degree murder under the felony murder rule. Even though he had never entered Christine Snyder's home, never touched Jessica Snyder, and never held a weapon, he was held legally responsible for her death. After deliberating for several hours, the jury recommended death by a vote of 7-5. The judge agreed with the recommendation. After years of appeals, Hall's death sentence was eventually commuted to life in prison without parole.
Most states in the U.S. have something known as a felony murder rule. That means that if someone gets killed in the process of a crime that's happening, then the people who are convicted of that crime will serve either life in jail without the chance of parole, or they could get the death penalty depending on the state. Now, in Florida, this law does apply, and as a result, a man by the name of Ryan Hall will be in prison for the rest of his life with no chance of parole.
But his case remains a stark example of how the smallest decision, lending a car to friends, can have the most devastating consequences. This is Linda Carty, and her path to death row began with a desperate plan to kidnap a baby that spiraled into murder. Carty, a Kittitian American living in Houston, was facing relationship problems and believed that having a baby would save her relationship. But her plan to steal someone else's child would end with her becoming the only British citizen on death row in America. In early May 2001, Carty and her husband separated. In her desperation, Carty convinced herself that having a baby would solve her relationship. She began telling friends and family that she was pregnant, even though she wasn't. She bought baby clothes, set up a nursery, and prepared for a child that didn't exist. But as her supposed due date approached, Carty realized she needed to produce an actual baby. That's when she hatched a plan that would ultimately lead to death row. Carty identified her target, Joanna Rodriguez, 20-year-old mother who had recently given birth to a son named Ray. Carty knew Rodriguez through mutual acquaintances, and she saw the young mother as the perfect source for the baby she desperately needed. But Carty's plan was doomed from the start. She recruited 3 men to help her kidnap both Rodriguez and her infant son. The idea was to take the baby and somehow convince everyone that it was Carty's own child. On May 16, 2001, Carty and her accomplices went to Rodriguez's apartment. What was supposed to be a simple kidnapping quickly turned violent. When Rodriguez resisted, the situation escalated. In the chaos that followed, Rodriguez was bound with duct tape and forced into the trunk of a car. Carty took the baby and left with her accomplices, believing she had successfully executed her plan. But Rodriguez suffocated in the trunk, turning Carty's kidnapping scheme into capital murder. The young mother died in the most horrific way possible, leaving behind not just her infant son, but also her boyfriend and extended family. Police discovered Rodriguez's body the next day. The investigation quickly led to Cardi, who was found caring for Rodriguez's baby as if it were her own child. "This is my son," Cardi insisted when police arrived. "I gave birth to him." But DNA evidence quickly proved that Cardi was not the baby's mother, and witness testimony placed her at the scene of the kidnapping.
What's wrong? I didn't do anything. I loaned my car out, and these people used my car.
The baby?
I don't have the baby.
Where's my baby? This supposed to be born today. You gonna born today?
The case against her was overwhelming. During the trial, prosecutors painted Cardi as a cold, calculating woman who had murdered an innocent mother to steal her child. This defendant didn't just take a baby, the prosecutor argued. She took a life. She destroyed a family. She killed a young woman whose only crime was being a loving mother.
My name is Linda Cardi, and I'm here in the state of Texas on death row.
What kind of human being abducts a mother out of her bed with a 3-day-old child? Who does that? What kind of person does that?
Cardi's defense team tried to argue that their client had never intended for Rodriguez to die, that the death was accidental. They portrayed Cardi as a desperate woman who had made terrible decisions but wasn't a cold-blooded killer. The most devastating testimony came from Rodriguez's family. Her mother took the stand and described the horror of losing her daughter in such a senseless way. The jury found Cardi guilty of capital murder. Cardi's case became international news because of her status as a British citizen facing execution in the United States. The British government formally protested her death sentence, and human rights organizations took up her cause. But for all the international attention, the basic facts remained unchanged. Linda Cardi had orchestrated a kidnapping that resulted in the death of a young mother, all because she believed having a baby would solve her problems. This is Troy Davis, and his journey to death row began with being in the wrong place at the wrong time when a police officer was killed in Savannah, Georgia. Davis maintained his innocence for over 20 years, but eyewitness testimony, later recanted by most witnesses, was enough to send him to the execution chamber in one of the most controversial cases in modern death penalty history. "I am innocent," Davis declared at his trial. "I did not kill Officer McPhail." The story begins on August 19th, 1989, in a Burger King parking lot in Savannah. Off-duty police officer Mark McPhail was working security at the restaurant when he heard a commotion from a nearby Greyhound bus station. A homeless man was being pistol whipped, and McPhail rushed to help. As McPhail approached the scene, someone shot him twice, once in the face and once in the chest. The 27-year-old officer and father of 2 died at the scene, cut down while trying to help a stranger. The investigation that followed was rushed and chaotic. Police needed to solve the murder of one of their own, and witnesses at the scene pointed to Troy Davis as the shooter. But Davis wasn't just any suspect. He was a young black man with a minor criminal record, and this was the South in 1989. The combination of racial tension and the killing of a police officer created enormous pressure to solve the case quickly. Davis insisted he was innocent from the moment of his arrest. "I fled the scene before any shots were fired." However, multiple witnesses identified Davis as the shooter. Their testimony was the foundation of the prosecution's case. There was no physical evidence linking Davis to the crime, no fingerprints on the weapon, no DNA evidence. The witnesses are clear. Prosecutor Spencer Lawton argued at trial. They saw Troy Davis shoot Officer McPhail. Their testimony is consistent and credible. Davis's defense team tried to argue that the witnesses were mistaken, that the chaos of the moment had led to misidentification. They pointed out that the shooting occurred at night in a poorly lit area during a confusing and violent situation. But the jury believed the witnesses. After deliberating for less than 2 hours, they found Davis guilty of murdering Officer McPhail. The defense tried to present evidence of Davis's character and background, but the jury had already made up their minds. They recommended death, and the judge agreed.
We cannot believe that the Board of Pardons and Paroles is allowing a person to go to his death despite the fact that serious doubts about his guilt remain unresolved.
But what happened after the trial was unprecedented. One by one, the witnesses who had testified against Davis began to recant their testimony. "I was scared," one witness later said. "The police kept pressuring me to identify Troy Davis, so I did, but I wasn't really sure it was him." Another witness revealed that police had threatened him with arrest if he didn't cooperate. "They told me I was going to jail if I didn't tell them what they wanted to hear," he said. By the time of Davis's first scheduled execution, 7 of the 9 witnesses who had testified against him had either recanted their testimony or significantly changed their stories. No physical evidence had ever connected Davis to the crime. The case became a cause célèbre for death penalty opponents around the world. Former President Jimmy Carter, Pope Benedict XVI, and Archbishop Desmond Tutu all called for Davis's sentence to be commuted. But Georgia officials stood by the conviction. They argued that Davis had received a fair trial and that his guilt had been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. The victim's family remained convinced of Davis's guilt. "Troy, Davis killed my brother," said Officer McPhail's brother. "All these years later, people are trying to make him look like a victim, but he's not. Mark is the victim." Davis spent more than 20 years on death row, maintaining his innocence and fighting for his life through the appeals process. 3 times, he received stays of execution as courts reviewed his case. But on September 21st, 2011, Troy Davis was executed by lethal injection at Georgia Diagnostic and Classification Prison.
Troy Davis supporters are still anguished today that their screams for mercy went unanswered, that a man they believe is innocent was killed.
Troy Davis! Troy Davis!
And that nervous police called for reinforcements.
15 police cars in a row.
I think it's tragic that this police officer died, but I think it's maybe even more tragic that this man who could be innocent was executed.
His last words were directed at Officer McPhail's family. "I'd like to address the McPhail family, let you know, despite the situation you are in, I'm not the one who killed your son, your father, your brother. I am innocent."
Said the incident that night was not my fault. I did not have a gun. And to the McPhail family, he said, of course, I did not personally kill your son, father, and brother. I am innocent.
This is Kenneth Foster, whose journey to death row began not with pulling a trigger, but with being the designated driver for friends who turned a night of robbery into murder. Foster never left his car, never entered the victim's home, and was 80 feet away when the fatal shot was fired. But under Texas law, that was close enough to earn him a death sentence. "I was just the driver," Foster would later testify. "I never knew anyone was going to die." The story begins on August 15, 1996, in San Antonio, Texas. Foster was 19 years old and agreed to drive 3 friends around the city for what he thought would be a night of petty robberies. The plan was simple. His friends would rob people, and he would wait in the car to drive them away. Foster had been the designated driver for similar robberies before. He would park nearby while his friends approached victims, demanded money, and then they would all drive away. It was criminal, but it was non-violent until that night. The group's final stop was at Michael LaHood Jr., 25-year-old man. Foster parked the car, Brown quickly exited, and just moments after, gunshots went off. Brown ran back to the car, jumped in, and Foster drove away. Their night of petty crimes had just become capital murder, and Foster was about to learn that in Texas, it doesn't matter if you pull the trigger. If you're part of a crime that results in death, you can face the death penalty. Police arrested Foster and his accomplices within days. While Brown was clearly the shooter, prosecutors decided to charge Foster with capital murder under the state's Law of Parties statute, which holds all participants in a crime equally responsible for its consequences. I knew they had guns, Foster admitted during questioning. I should have known something like this could happen. After deliberating, the jury recommended death. The judge agreed with their recommendation. After spending 11 years on death row, Foster's sentence was commuted to life in prison just hours before his scheduled execution in 2007. Then Governor Rick Perry made the rare decision to reduce the sentence, citing Foster's minimal role in the actual killing. Kenneth Foster was a willing participant in a crime that led to death, Perry said, but I believe his sentence should be commuted to life imprisonment. And still, to this day, Foster remains in prison. These 5 cases show that the road to death row isn't always lined with cold-blooded murder. It can begin with a borrowed car, a wrong turn, or just being in the wrong place at the wrong time. What makes these stories so disturbing isn't just the crimes, but the thin, fragile line between guilt and punishment. They remind us that the justice system is human, and humans get it wrong. Sometimes, it's not about what someone did, but where they were, who they were with, or how the system chose to see them. And in a system that can't be reversed, even the smallest actions can carry the weight of a death sentence.